In the last lecture, Napoleon Bonaparte seized the French Revolution and made himself the center of the French state. In this one, he will make France the center of a European empire far larger than anything dreamed of by Louis XIV. Now, everyone in Europe knew that the Peace of Amiens would not last. There were Napoleon's ambitions for France. There was the British belief, going back to William III, Marlborough, and Anne, in the balance of power. There was the widespread conviction among European monarchs and aristocrats that Napoleon and his French Revolution were a menace to hierarchy and order, which was of course true. In some ways, the Allies in the Napoleonic Wars were making a last-ditch stand to preserve the Ancien Regime and the Great Chain of Being. And so both sides spent 1802 and 1803 girding for a resumption of hostilities. In particular, Napoleon saw quite clearly that while he could invade Italy and defeat the Austrian army to his heart's content, he would always be limited by the wealth and the navy of Great Britain. So he began to prepare for one last great showdown between Britain and France, the climax of the Second Hundred Years' War. By 1803, it was clear that Napoleon was building up his forces in the Netherlands and at Boulogne in France for the purpose of invading Great Britain. He had the usual problem facing all invaders of Great Britain. Since Britain is an island, or rather a series of islands, he couldn't simply march there. So he assembled a fleet of barges on his north coast. But those barges would be easy pickings for the Royal Navy. They had to be convoyed by the Imperial French Navy. Now, the good news here was that thanks to some quick diplomatic footwork, they would have the assistance of the Spanish Navy as well. The bad news was that both of his navies were hundreds of miles away, stuck in the Mediterranean. And the really bad news was that to sail up the west coast of Europe and rendezvous with the French army, Napoleon's navy would have to get past the Royal Navy under Admiral Lord Nelson. Nelson had been a thorn in Napoleon's side since the Battle of the Nile. In 1798, he'd restored the Neapolitan royal family when Bonaparte's sympathizers had driven them off. In 1801, he'd persuaded the Danes to abandon Napoleon by destroying their fleet at the Battle of Copenhagen. Now in command of Britain's largest fleet, his flag in the rather presumptuously named HMS Victory, Nelson shadowed the French fleet like some relentless dog. He kept them bottled up in Toulon for 2 years. When, in 1805, they finally broke out, he chased them all the way across the Atlantic to the West Indies and back. Finally, in the fall, they rendezvoused with the Spanish at Cadiz. Nelson cornered that French-Spanish fleet on the morning of the 21st of October, 1805, off of Cape Trafalgar, Spain. The result would be one of the decisive battles of world history. At stake was the continued existence of Great Britain, the fate of Europe, and world naval supremacy for the next 100 years. Now, to understand why Nelson is considered a naval genius, you have to understand that until the invention of swivel gun turrets in the 19th century, warships could only fire their rows of cannons to the side, hence the term broadside. So most naval battles from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution involved very little in the way of imagination. The two opposing fleets simply lined up against each other and fired away. In fact, this is why battleships during the Age of Sail were called ships of the line. But the British fleet, about 27 vessels, was outnumbered about 3-2 in this battle, so a traditional line of battle would not have worked out so well. What Nelson did was to arrange his ships in two lines perpendicular to the French and the Spanish. That is, he allowed his opponent to present their full broadsides to him, or in the naval parlance of the day, to in effect cross his T. Now, Nelson is often praised for this tactic, but in fact, it should have been a disaster. My undergraduate supervisor, Professor Daniel Baugh of Cornell University, was a historian of 18th century naval warfare and a former naval officer, and he used to point out that Nelson's brilliance wasn't the tactic itself. It was in knowing his enemy. He knew that the British sailors were better trained and better shots. He counted on the French and the Spanish missing their target as he approached. I would add one more piece to his tactical brilliance that day. Much is often made of the famous signal to the fleet, run up the yardarm of the Victory that morning. England expects every man to do his duty. It was certainly a nice touch, though apparently Nelson's commanders wondered what Nelson was on about. I mean, of course they were going to do their duty. But I attach much more significance to the ship's band of the Victory as she sailed into the French fire. They played traditional English naval and military music, Heart of Oak and Rural Britannia. Surely, like the Marseillaise, you know Rule Britannia. I shouldn't have to do this, right? Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. Britons never, never, never will be slaves. Except you've got to imagine it played by a ship's band. You've got to imagine it booming across the water, the way military music does outdoors. Imagine being the French commander, Admiral Villeneuve, or a French or a Spanish seaman in the bowels of his ship, crouched next to his cannon when you hear that song coming at you across the water for hours. When you realize it's Nelson out there, the most famous sailor in the world, and we've never beaten him. What's he doing? Why is he letting us cross his T? And still he comes, slowly, inexorably. These ships make about 10 miles per hour, relentlessly, all morning. No wonder they couldn't shoot straight. Finally, just before noon, the two British columns crashed into the main French and Spanish line of battle. Now the tables are turned. The British can fire their broadsides into the bows and the sterns of the enemy fleet at point-blank range, raking their decks, causing, in effect, internal bleeding in the French and Spanish fleet. The result was terrific carnage and bloodshed, which included Nelson himself. He had insisted on pacing the deck of the Victory wearing a coat adorned with all of his medals, possibly to inspire his men, but there's also some evidence of a death wish there. He was picked off by a French sharpshooter, carried below decks, dying, a bullet in his lung. He demanded to know how many French and Spanish ships had surrendered. When told 20, he said, not enough. Finally, when told 30, he knew that he had won, and he uttered his famous dying words, "Now I am satisfied. Thank God I have done my duty." Trafalgar saved Britain from invasion. It stopped Napoleon at sea, and it left the Royal Navy the undisputed masters of the sea for over a century. And that is why, to this day, every October 21st, in the wardrooms of the Royal Navy, the toast is given to the immortal memory. But that didn't mean the Napoleonic Wars or Napoleon's dreams of empire were over. In fact, as with Philip II's attempt to knock Britain out of his war with the Spanish Armada, this conflict was just beginning. After Trafalgar, Napoleon turned inland and made himself the master of much of Europe. In 1805, he defeated the Austrian and the Russian armies at Austerlitz, knocking the former out of the war. In 1806, he seized Naples, naming his brother Joseph king. He conquered the Netherlands, placing his brother Louis on that throne. He conquered Germany, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, and consolidated some 300 small German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, which took its orders from Napoleon. This was actually, though, a crucial step towards what would later become a united Germany. When the Prussians declared war, he destroyed the vaunted Prussian army. Remember the Prussian army? At Jena. Prussia lost territory and became a client state. The shame and resentment at being beaten by Napoleon, by the Prussians, would outlast Napoleon. In 1807, he defeated the Russians again at Friedland, resulting in the Treaty of Tilsit. Tsar Alexander I recognized Napoleon as the Emperor of the West and promised economic cooperation. In return, Napoleon promised to leave Russia alone in the East, two emperors negotiating with each other. Napoleon's brother Jerome, heretofore unprovided for, was made king of Westphalia by carving that territory out of Prussia. Napoleon seized Portugal, and in 1808 he invaded Spain, promoting Joseph to that crown. Naples went to an in-law. By 1810, all of Western continental Europe, to the borders of Russia, was either ruled directly by Napoleon or was a client state ruled by a family member. Napoleon was founding a dynasty. In 1809, he divorced his first childless wife, the Empress Josephine. In 1810, he married the daughter of the Austrian emperor, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, a Habsburg. In 1811, she gave birth to a son, Napoleon Jr. Nobody called him Napoleon Jr. Napoleon Sr. was now a fully fledged member of the club of European crowned heads. Only the British and their navy stood in the way of total domination of the West. So after Trafalgar, he had to devise a new plan to integrate his empire into one Europe, not seen since Charlemagne, and, along the way, starve out the nation of shopkeepers as he so derisively referred to them. The result was something called the Continental System, which Napoleon devised in 1806. It was a tariff union, or a common market, for all of Europe. The idea was there would be no customs barriers between European states. Goods were to flow freely. Its ports were closed to British goods. The idea was to make Europe economically self-sufficient and prosperous, and to encourage French industry. Since British manufacturers were verboten, French industry would have to step up. And of course, finally, the Continental System was meant to choke off British trade and the British economy. They needed to trade manufactured goods for wheat. British exports dropped between 1807 and 1808 20%. The winter of 1810-11 was especially hard, so the British really took it on the chin from the Continental System. But it was even harder on the continent. The British Navy maintained a blockade of its own. Europe couldn't get any American grain, and by the way, the tensions here helped to explain the War of 1812 between Britain and America. French manufacturers, the French economy, failed to keep up with European demand. The rest of Europe grew increasingly resentful of the Continental System's economic restrictions. They wanted to trade with Britain, which, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, has lots of cheap, desirable goods. In fact, these economic resentments of Napoleon were not the only ones. At first, Napoleon and his armies were greeted enthusiastically by Germans, by Poles, by Belgians, Italians, and Spaniards, because they expected him to bring the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, fraternity, and equality. Remember, Napoleon was the revolution on horseback, as he liked to say. Now, in fact, Napoleon did dismantle much of the Ancien Regime in these countries. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire. He abolished serfdom and seigneurial dues. He broke down old trade barriers and privileges with his Continental System. And he did give these people written constitutions with legislatures, free public education, state-supported academies of the arts, the Napoleonic Code, and civil rights for Jews and other minority groups. No wonder that the composer Ludwig van Beethoven, a great champion of equality and liberal causes, originally dedicated his greatest symphony to date, the Third, to Napoleon as liberator. But when Beethoven learned that Napoleon had made himself emperor, he angrily tore up the title page and renamed the piece Symphonia Eroica, to the memory of a great man. I would argue that that moment encapsulates how all of Europe came to think of Napoleon. As the nature of Napoleon's rule and empire sank in, people began to dislike it. Instead of liberating conquered peoples and going home, Napoleon stayed in one way or another. Often, the promise of these new constitutions remained just that, a promise. People resented the high taxes and the conscription of their young men for endless wars of conquest. They resented his police state, strict censorship of the press, and the fact that he did actually establish a secret police that monitored the activities of dissidents all throughout Europe. They resented the Continental System, as we have seen. And perhaps, above all, they resented the French. Remember how French nationalism was born when Prussians and Austrians invaded France? Well, it turns out nobody much likes an occupier. The presence of French troops and French language and French culture now inspired a nationalistic reaction among Germans and Poles and Italians and Spaniards. It was like they were suddenly reminded that we're not French. Sometimes these resentments express themselves culturally. In Germany and Italy, there was a literary revival, as native cultures were increasingly seen as patriotic. Beethoven wrote Fidelio, an opera, and also incidental music for Goethe's play Egmont. Both were about political oppression, patriots imprisoned by tyrannical powers for their beliefs, and the triumph of liberty. Elsewhere, these resentments were expressed at the point of a gun. In 1808, Spain erupted into guerrilla war against the French army. Aided by British troops, commanded by a young English nobleman named Arthur Wellesley, the resulting Peninsular War tied down 250,000 French troops. The greatest general and empire on earth could not defeat a brutal insurgency. Both sides committed terrible atrocities. Some 300,000 casualties resulted. In Italy, secret bands of nationalistic guerrillas, the Carbonari, named after the charcoal marks that members placed on their foreheads after secret initiations, attacked French troops. Prussia, in the meantime, quietly reformed. The Prussians were going to do it by the book. They were going to reform their administration, and they were going to resurrect their army, and they were going to fight Napoleon on the field. Russia just ignored the continental system. Russia was technically independent of Napoleon's empire, but it was expected to trade within the continental system. The Russians chafed at this. They wanted British manufactured goods. They needed to trade timber and naval stores, which the British needed so desperately for their navy. Smuggling on both sides was widespread. Napoleon reacted by resolving in 1812 to teach the Russians a lesson. In June of 1812, he marched into Russia with an army of 600,000 men, conscripted from all around the empire, which means that only about a third of them were French. Now, Napoleon planned a typical campaign. They all went the same way. He would meet the Russians on the field of battle. He would fight a decisive battle a la Austerlitz or Jena, defeat them, at which point the Tsar would surrender all of Mother Russia to Napoleon on cue. But the Russians had learned something. They had studied Napoleon's campaigns, and they'd studied what had happened to everybody else in Europe. They knew they were probably not going to defeat Napoleon in a set-piece battle. That happened almost never. Instead, they used a time-honored strategy for defeating a superior enemy that dated back to the ancient Greeks. Retreat into the vastness of Russia. Burn the crops so that Napoleon's troops would have to rely on increasingly extended supply lines across Poland. Use guerrilla tactics to harry both the army and the supply lines, and pray. Pray for the arrival of Russia's secret weapon, Russia's greatest commander, General Winter, the Russian Winter. Now, in fact, both sides were able to implement their favored strategies. Russians burned the crops and retreated and harried the imperial army and its supply lines. But Napoleon did get his set-piece battle in September at a place called Borodino, just outside of Moscow, and he won. But the Russians under General Kutuzov inflicted heavy casualties. Now, the victory enabled Napoleon to take Moscow more or less unopposed, and he did so. He then set up his headquarters and waited for the Tsar to surrender his empire. But a funny thing happened on the way to Napoleon's greatest triumph. The Tsar never showed up. Napoleon waited 5 weeks in Moscow, still no Tsar. Instead, a mysterious fire broke out, which burned down 3/4 of Moscow, including the grain stores that Napoleon was depending on to feed his troops. Suddenly, the greatest general in Europe found himself saddled with Europe's greatest army and no food, and he was over 1,000 miles away from the borders of his empire. And then winter arrived. On the 19th of October, 1812, Napoleon began the long retreat home. Cold, disease, and starvation took their toll. Expecting a quick campaign, Napoleon had neglected to provide winter uniforms for his men. They were continuously attacked by Russian partisans, and in the end, the imperial army crossed back into Poland with only 100,000 out of the 600,000 that had crossed that border in the spring. 5 of 6 men who embarked on the Russian campaign never came back. From this point on, Napoleon's spell was broken, and other nations rose up. In the spring of 1813, Napoleon was defeated at Leipzig at the Battle of the Nations, which was fought by the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussians. One of the things that happened after the retreat from Russia was that British diplomats fanned out all over Europe trying to reconstruct the Grand Alliance, and they were very successful to do so, in part because they were able to promise British money. A British-Spanish force at the same time, 1813, crossed the Pyrenees into France itself. Numerous revolts broke out among subject peoples. On the 31st of March, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. His idea was to save some of the empire for his infant son. But instead, the Allies declared the empire dissolved and exiled Napoleon to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. In September 1814, they convened a peace conference, the Congress of Vienna, which was intended to put Europe back together. Also, at this time, Louis XVI's brother returned to France and was restored to the French throne as Louis XVIII, thus maintaining the French tradition that all kings must be made Louis. But Napoleon was not quite through. In February of 1815, he escaped from Elba. He landed in Italy, and he rallied the remnants of the imperial army. There was great nostalgia attached to the name of Napoleon, and there's some sense that the former soldiers had nothing to gain in a royalist France. Anyway, this produced mass panic among the recently restored royalists in Paris. They fled yet again. Napoleon returned to Paris and reclaimed the imperial throne in March. At the same time, the Allies, Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, each pledged 150,000 men to assemble for a second invasion of France out of Belgium. Napoleon's plan was to smash this force before it could be fully formed. That spring, he drove north, hoping to drive a wedge between the Prussian army under Marshal Blucher, stationed at Namur, and the British army under Arthur Wellesley, now Duke of Wellington, at Brussels. He wanted to do that before the Austrian and Russian armies, farther to the east, could join up. Beginning on the 15th of June, 1815, near the village of Waterloo in Belgium, the British tried to hold off the main French army, while the Prussians fought to join them. Throughout the battle, which lasted several days, the French continually outmaneuvered both the British and the Prussians. The battle climaxed on the 18th of June. Napoleon threw troops at Wellington all day. By 4 p.m., the British forces were flagging. Wellington at this point said that he would hold on for nightfall or Blucher. At that point, 4 p.m., Marshal Blucher arrived with the Prussian army, just in the nick of time. At the end of the day, desperate, Napoleon threw the Old Guard, made up of his most hardened veterans, against the British infantry. But the British infantry held. At about 8 p.m., a Prussian charge broke the French lines. Napoleon fled, and Prussian forces pursued the French into the night, leaving 45,000 dead on the field of Waterloo. Napoleon abdicated again 4 days later. He formally surrendered to the captain of HMS Bellerophon on the 15th of July, 1815. How fitting that he should surrender to the captain of a British warship, because it was, after all, the Royal Navy, beginning with Trafalgar, that had ultimately stopped him. This time the Allies took no chances. Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, a remote British possession in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that isn't near anything. There was no possibility of escape. Napoleon died there of cancer just 6 years later, and the rumors of poisoning have been rife ever since. Historians generally discount them, but you never know what the DNA evidence will tell you tomorrow. The Congress of Vienna, in the meantime, had been meeting. It was the last and the greatest of the 18th century peace conferences, and like them, it tried to preserve the peace by balancing the exorbitant of power of France. But it was also the first to really tackle the issues left over from the French Revolution, the rights of man, nationalism, etc. Now, the Congress was dominated by 5 great powers: Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and now that it was safely a monarchy again, France. One of the wisest things the framers of the Congress of Vienna did was they invited France to participate, a mistake that was avoided that would be made at Versailles 100 years later. There were 3 great conservative statesmen who actually made all the decisions at Vienna. First, the Austrian foreign minister, Prince Clemens von Metternich. Second, the British foreign minister, Robert Stewart Viscount Castlereagh. And third, the French foreign minister, Count Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who had managed to serve just about every French government that had existed since the French Revolution, so he's a great survivor. All 3 were monarchists, and they hated the French Revolution. They hated nationalism. Their dearest wish was to restore the Ancien Regime, the old balance of power. And so, on the surface, the Congress of Vienna looks like an attempt to turn the clock back and ignore that 1789 had ever happened. In France, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. So were its old pre-1792 borders. As for the rest of Europe, a balance of power against France was sought by ringing France with strong buffer states. Now, to do that, they had to ignore nationalism. trading small countries around like so many baseball cards. So, the Netherlands to the north of France had to be enlarged. It now included Belgium, the former Austrian Netherlands, and before that the Spanish Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Sardinia, the former Savoy, was enlarged to the south of France. Prussia and Saxony were enlarged, and the former was given territory along the Rhine to the east of France. Now that's very important. Prussia was primarily an agricultural state, but now, at the very dawn of its industrial revolution, Prussia is given the Ruhr Valley, loaded with minerals and coal deposits. Austria, in compensation for the loss of the Austrian Netherlands, gets northern Italy. Following Napoleon's idea, the states of the Holy Roman Empire are consolidated into 38. Russia gets Poland and Finland, with dire consequences for their people. What about Britain? As at Utrecht, the British aren't interested in European territory. Instead, as usual, they take potential, valuable naval bases on the way to lucrative trades. All they ask for is Cape Colony, South Africa, which would of course later turn out to be sitting on diamond mines, Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and Malta in the Mediterranean. They're all places on the way to somewhere else. So on the surface, this looks very much like any other 18th century peace conference. Great powers try to contain the greatest. France, as usual. They carve up the rest of the world to suit themselves. Look at poor Catholic Belgium. It used to be Flanders, then it was the Spanish Netherlands, then it was occupied periodically by Louis XIV, then it was the Austrian Netherlands, and now it's united with the Protestant Dutch. This makes geographic sense, but it doesn't make any religious or cultural sense. It looks like a complete negation of the French Revolution, and in this case, nationalism. France was a monarchy again, national self-determination and cultural differences are completely ignored. British naval and military dominance once again is affirmed. The British have won the Second Hundred Years' War, begun in 1688. So, this raises a question for us. When all is said and done, what had the French Revolution really accomplished? Wasn't it just a lot of sound and fury about much, but resulting in nothing? Well, not if we look more closely at that settlement of 1815. Let's go back to France. It's true, the Bourbons were restored, but they were restored to a constitutional monarchy, not that different from the one of 1791, from the Constitution of 1791. The new regime had a written constitution. It had a legislature, elected by property owners. The revolutionary land settlement stood. The Code Napoleon, an equality under the law. Napoleon's reforms of the bureaucracy and local government all remain in force. In fact, they're still the basis of French local government. Above all, the Ancien Regime, the privileges of the church and of the aristocracy, were never restored. In their place, the middling orders had gained an identity and political power. Having had a taste of power, they were not going to go away. They were going to demand more of it, and that will be one of the great stories of the 19th century. As far as Europe is concerned, perhaps the biggest significance of the French Revolution was that it spread these ideas and these examples across Europe. In fact, the crown heads of Europe would increasingly be on the defensive against their own people's demands for accountable government, for the vote, for a free press, for equality under the law, for individual liberty, all of which amount to what we might call a species of liberalism. And from henceforward, I'm going to use the term liberalism as a sort of shorthand for this combination of ideas. In addition, Napoleon's attempt to unite Europe had inspired a nationalism in response, emphasizing the value of one's own culture and traditions, the desire for self-determination of different ethnic groups, including, and maybe especially the small ones, the Belgians, the Poles, the Baltic peoples, the Slavs, the Magyars, who now wanted liberal, egalitarian constitutions of their own. The result would be a whole series of liberal and nationalistic revolts in waves between the 1820s and 1848. Now, in defense of the Congress of Vienna, it should also be pointed out that for all of this turmoil, there would be no general European war again for 99 years, not until 1914. In that sense, the Congress of Vienna was a great success. So the French Revolution, while failing in many of its aims, did have a lasting significance well beyond the borders of France, perhaps more as an idea than as an institution. The 19th century would be a century of political revolutions. Before turning to those revolutions, though, it's necessary to turn to the economic and the social changes taking place since the mid-18th century in Europe, for it could be argued that they were more important still. It's time to examine the revolution which has, in my view, had the greatest impact on our lives, the Industrial Revolution.